for scene 7, the plotting scene, Claudius and Laertes plotting how to kill Hamlet and make it look like an accident when he gets back to Denmark. Most famously, or more famously, I suppose, it's the scene is interrupted at the very end by Gertrude coming in to deliver her shocking news about Ophelia's death. Now, at just a hair under 200 lines, it's one of the longer scenes in the play. There are several that are longer, 2.2 and 5.2, of course. 1.2 is also longer, as is the play within a play in 3.2. But this scene has always, I was surprised when I just reviewed the line count and saw that it doesn't even break 200 lines, because 4.7 has always seemed to me to be longer than it actually is. This is not to say that it's boring, of course, but in terms of its length on the page to how long it feels, there's something of a discrepancy. Now, I guess this is accounted for by the fact that in the other scenes in the play that are on the longer side, a lot happens. People are moving from place to place, doing things. There's action. In 3.4, which is longish and all talking, at least the talking is, a heated argument, and of course someone gets stabbed at the very beginning of that scene, and the ghost shows up in the middle of it. So there are other events that lend a sort of excitement to, say, Act 3, Scene 4, even though it is mostly just a long and complex conversation. 4.7 is lent a lot of dramatic import by what Gertrude comes in to say at the very end of it, of course. But, unlike the stabbing of Polonius in 3.4, this is something that happens at the end of the scene, not something that happens at the beginning. I mean, there are ways to stage it that can cut down on how much time it seems to be eating up. Indeed, when uncut, and almost all productions of Hamlet are trimmed. When trimmed productions of Hamlet are made, 4.7 is one of the scenes that I think tends to get most heavily chopped up. You need to preserve the facts of the poisoned swords fencing scheme, of course, and you want to preserve not just the import of, but all of the great speech in which she says it, what Gertrude comes in to say at the end. But a lot of 4.7 does get cut. The fact that usually, although there are different ways you could stage it, Claudius and Laertes are sitting down, as opposed to the other long scenes. There's generally a lot of moving around. If you're going to be clandestinely plotting how to kill someone and make it look like an accident, presumably you're doing this seated at a table in the proverbial smoky room. I mean, I guess you could, just for the sake of making it pop a little more, pull an Aaron Sorkin and have Claudius and Laertes, speed walking down a corridor, shoulder to shoulder, being handed things while plotting how to kill Hamlet. But that doesn't seem to be a very realistic way of staging the conception of a murder plot. I'm almost tempted to say Shakespeare made, and again, we're not going to use the word boring, almost tempted to believe that Shakespeare deliberately made this scene drag just a little bit so that Gertrude bursting in with the "there is a willow grows askant the brook" speech at the end would shock us all the more. But I will say this: whenever I've found myself thinking that some scene in Hamlet is on average not quite as important or as packed with important stuff to talk about as some of the other scenes are, I've inevitably ended up later having an epiphany where I realize it's My connection is unstable. Well, how long is my connection going to be unstable? Okay. Whenever I've caught myself thinking that some scene in Hamlet is comparatively unimportant, I inevitably end up having an epiphany later on where I realize it's actually the key to the whole play. I fully expect to have such an epiphany about Act 4, Scene 7 someday. I haven't had it yet, but nevertheless, there are certainly a bunch of things that bear pointing out about it. Well, we can start with the very first thing the king says. Sith you have heard, he's speaking to Laertes, and with a knowing ear, that he which hath your noble father slain pursued my life. In other words, you know you can trust me because the guy who killed your dad Polonius was trying to kill me. Now, we, the audience, know this. How does Claudius know? Remember, he was informed of this by Gertrude in Act 4, Scene 1, and Gertrude, we saw in the video for that scene, was largely BSing him, emphasizing that Hamlet was so crazy he couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality, and thought that Polonius was actually a rat behind the curtain. Now, we did see Claudius react by going, it had been so with us had we been there. Had I been behind the curtain next to Polonius, as I was in Act 3, Scene 1, spying on Hamlet, it could have been me, but we did not see Claudius conclude, and we certainly didn't see Gertrude tell him that it was intended to be him. Not just that it could have been accidentally. So when Claudius begins this scene by saying, he which hath your noble father slain pursued my life, is he just doesn't suspect this and he's BSing Laertes to be more buddy-buddy with him and seduce him the more effectively into his plot to kill Hamlet? Or has Claudius somehow put two and two together and deduced that, or technically abduced, if we're being persnickety about the different types of reasoning here, and I see no reason why we shouldn't be, figured out that Hamlet was actually intending to kill him. Anyway, when Laertes demands to know, why didn't you punish him already? How come I had to storm the castle with a mob, and then I find out he's on some errand to England? Now, Claudius presumably has not told Laertes that, don't worry, I sent letters along with Hamlet indicating to the King of England that he should kill him. Why hasn't he told him that? Good question. After all, the two of them don't yet know that a messenger is going to enter on the next page informing them that Hamlet is on his way back. But, well, Shakespeare has to have them talking about something for a page or so before the messenger comes in, so let's bear with them. The reasons Claudius gives about why he did not punish Hamlet yet. Reason 1, the queen his mother, in line 11, the queen his mother lives almost by his looks, and for myself, my virtue or my plague, be it either which, she is so conjunctive to my life and soul that as the star moves not but in his sphere, I could not but by her. There is yet another, for people who are keeping track, reference to the by then outdated geocentric model of the solar system. The star, not the stars, but singular the star would mean the sun. So the star moving in his sphere would mean in its orbit around the Earth, something that Shakespeare's audience, at least the more scientifically minded ones, knew was not the case by the time the play is being staged. We've seen Shakespeare have fun with this earlier, most centrally in Act 2, Scene 2. That when the characters make reference to geocentrism, it's something that as befits the play's medieval setting, the characters would have believed at the time, but in a bit of scientifically based dramatic irony, Shakespeare's audience would have known was not true by the time they're watching the play. I think Shakespeare is using geocentrism versus heliocentrism as a running metaphor about the shifting nature of what the truth appears to be based on our the position from which we are observing it. Anyway, the other motive why to a public count I might not go is the great love the general gender bear him. So the other reason, in addition to the fact that it would break his mom's heart if I executed Hamlet, is the fact that he's so popular with the people. They, we are told, convert his gyves to graces, so that my arrows, too slightly timbered for so loud a wind, would have reverted to my bow again, and not where I had aimed them. Claudius appears to be actually afraid that there would be a popular revolt if he punished Hamlet. And this is the second time he's raised this concern. At the beginning of Act 4, Scene 3, he remarked that Hamlet is loved of the distracted multitude, who like not in their judgment but their eyes, and where 'tis so the offender's scourge is weighed, but never the offense. So we've twice now heard Claudius talk about how popular with the people Hamlet is. I think Shakespeare is having his evil king belabor this point so that it occurs to us to contrast Hamlet's bafflingly solitary course of action with Laertes' plan, as we saw in Act 4, Scene 5, to storm the castle at the head of a mob. Right? We're wondering, well, if Laertes was able to get to persuade a mob to storm the castle and overthrow Claudius, obviously this would have been a piece of cake for Hamlet to do. If the people love him already and he's smarter and more eloquent than Laertes is, yet it never even occurs to Hamlet to do this. So that's one thing we're being reminded to think about here. The other is this idea of Claudius's supposed genuine and deep love for Gertrude. As the star moves not but in his sphere, I could not but by her. In other words, I love her, so I couldn't live without her, and she couldn't live without her son, so I can't punish her son, at least not in a way that she'll be able to trace back to me. Now, how seriously are we supposed to take this? We did hear already in Act 3, Scene 3, and I think we're thinking of those lines again now, when Claudius gives my crown, mine own ambition, and my queen as his list of the effects for which I did the murder, that he is still possessed of when he is hypocritically, he realizes, praying for forgiveness in 3.3. The very titillating double meaning of that line, when he says that his queen is one of the effects for which I did the murder. Does he mean that he did the murder just because he wanted to end up with her, or should that be taken as implying that she put him up to it, or that it was her idea? So whether we've debated Gertrude's possible motivations for marrying Claudius and so quickly ad infinitum, we might also debate his reasons for marrying her. Was it just to because she was the former queen, to make his acceptance as king more fluid and smooth in the people's eyes? Was it just that he is into her sexually, thinks she's hot, but doesn't necessarily love her? Or do we believe him when he says that he actually is madly in love with her? Well, his we're jumping ahead a couple of scenes here, but remember he said this, his efforts to interfere in Gertrude's eventual fate in Act 5, Scene 2, as we'll soon see, can be described as, let's say, minimal at best. Odd behavior for someone who could not move but by her, as he says here. Okay. We can jump ahead to the messenger entering at around line 38. Letters, my lord, from Hamlet, this to your majesty, this to the queen. Now, I have a big star and a big question mark next to this line. Notice that the messenger has multiple letters from Hamlet to deliver here. He hands one to the king and then exits to the other one in his other hand, this to the queen. We must notice and should not forget here, Hamlet has written another letter to his mom that the messenger is on his way to deliver. Possibly Gertrude has even read. That's another reason why this scene, it now occurs to me, might be so long. It gives Gertrude a plausible amount of time to have read whatever this other letter says before she finally enters the room around line 163. Whether she has read it by the time she enters is a question mark here. And of course, what it says is an even bigger question mark. We know that Hamlet has also written to his mother, the queen. We never find out what this letter says. And if he is already on his way back, already on the pirate ship, as we found out in 4-6 that he was, that means he's already discovered the letter from Claudius to the King of England saying, kill Hamlet, make it look like an accident. Does he bring this to his mother's attention in this letter that the messenger is on his way to deliver? Our running tally of wondering what Gertrude does or doesn't know is getting almost unmanageable. Early on in the play, of course, the main question was, did she or didn't she know about the murder? That question is still there. But now we've got this subheading to it. If she didn't know before, right, from Claudius because she was in on it, does she know now because Hamlet has told her? Maybe even enclosed, right, the original letter from Claudius to the King of England in the letter to her as proof. Now there is in the so-called bad quarto of 1603, I mentioned that 4.6, the act, the scene to which we were just referring, is totally different. That scene, Gertrude is explicitly informed. We see her informed on stage and react to the fact that Claudius sent the letter along with Hamlet, with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to give to the King of England so that he'll kill Hamlet. Horatio informs her, having been informed by Hamlet himself via letter. In the real version of the play, Hamlet does eventually inform Horatio of this, but verbally at the beginning of Act 5, Scene 2. He hasn't mentioned anything about Claudius's plot with the King of England to Horatio in the letter that Horatio reads aloud in 4-6. Obviously doesn't mention anything about it in the letter that we see the king read aloud in a moment. But there are 3 letters. One to Horatio, one to the king, and one to the queen. We hear the first one read aloud in the previous scene. We hear this one read aloud right now. We never hear or even get the gist of what was said in the letter to his mom. It's just a huge question mark, perhaps one of the biggest, certainly I think the biggest question mark of the last movement of the play, where we are not technically in the 5th act yet, but 4-7 is more or less the beginning of the end. That's one of the things we're wondering about in terms of what's on the Queen's mind. We might also observe at line 40, we have the play's one and only mention of the mysterious Claudio. The messenger says, when asked who brought the letters, "Sailors, my lord, they say, I saw them not. They were given me by Claudio. He received them of him that brought them." Now, we could read this as meaning, okay, so there's some other dude who works at Elsinore Castle named Claudio, and, we don't see him. Who cares? Except that the messenger says that this guy, Claudio, received the letters of him, i.e., the sailor that brought them. We saw in 4-6 that the guy who received the letters from the sailors that brought them was Horatio. So, is this just somebody's, this Claudio business, just somebody's misprint, or is it evidence of the fact that in an earlier draft of the play, Horatio's name was Claudio instead of Horatio? It would make sense since, Shakespeare elsewhere and around the same time had used Claudio as the name of a sort of sidekick character in Much Ado About Nothing. Now, given that Shakespeare presumably would not have placed a Claudio and a Claudius in the same play, if Horatio's name used to be Claudio before Shakespeare changed it to Horatio, does this mean, and it probably would, that Claudius's name was originally something else? This is the first version of the old Hamlet legend in which the murdering uncle's, the usurping uncle's name is Claudius, as opposed to some variant of Feng or Fengon, the original Scandinavian name. I mentioned in the video for Act 3, Scene 4, that very possibly Shakespeare changed the uncle's name just to set up that deep pull Roman history joke about Hamlet assuming that the guy hiding behind the curtain must be Claudius, because the historical Roman emperor Claudius was hiding behind a curtain in all the hubbub when the Praetorian Guard was murdering Caligula and the rest of his family in 41 AD. That this is a joke about what a nerd Hamlet is. He makes assumptions about real life based on school, and that it's a deep pull supporting pillar of the whole difference between education and real life theme that Shakespeare is playing with throughout the play. So I'll point broadly on the significance of names. We also talked about possible significances of Ophelia's name. Shakespeare, contrary to popular belief, actually did not invent the name Ophelia, though he might have noticed possible symbolic values or punning values on it. For example, love of nothing, right? The suffix philia attached to an O or a zero. We know that other names besides this possible Claudio Horatio thing. Now, Horatio's name, right, echoing that of the ancient Roman poet Horace, backs up the implication at the ending, right? When Horatio ends up being one of the play's lone survivors, being instructed by Hamlet in 5-2 to, in this harsh world, draw thy breath in pain to tell my story. No, you've got to stay around to tell everybody what happened. The idea that Horatio then goes on to, in effect, write the play. That Horatio is Shakespeare's surrogate in the play, right? As the chronicler, the one who doesn't participate in the action much, but is going to survive and write it all down. And indeed, it's not uncommon in stagings and films of the play to do some subtle visual cues where they make up the guy playing Horatio to kind of look like Shakespeare, making the play sort of go in a circle. It happens and then it's redone on stage, which ends with the promise for it to be redone on stage, right, forever and ever in a circle. Beating James Joyce to that idea by 300 plus years. Polonius's name is different in the Bad Quarto as well. His name is Carambus. Now, whether Polonius's name was originally Carambus, or whether, as some people think, the Bad Quarto was reflects a different version of the play that was used for touring universities. And that one fairly amusing theory is that whenever whenever the Lord Chamberlain's men put on Hamlet at Oxford, they changed the name of the Polonius character to Carambus because the founder of Oxford was a guy with the last name Polonius. And they didn't want the students to think that they were making fun of Oxford with that character and start booing. So whether Polonius's name was originally Carambus and then changed sometime after 1603 to Polonius for whatever reason by Shakespeare, or whether it was always Polonius and they only changed it when they played at Oxford, we don't know. But as far as significance of names, the name Hamlet itself, we might pause over here as long as we're talking about names. Now, Shakespeare was not the first to present the prince's name as Hamlet, right? It was, Amleda, with the what's the F, the thing that looks like the curvy D with the line through it, that old Anglo-Saxon letter. Then afterwards it was Amleth, and then eventually Hamlet. But I think one previous author, Belforest or somebody, had spelled the name the way Shakespeare spells it. But he still could have noticed a potential for punning on the name, since the other use of the term Hamlet for a small town was already current in Shakespeare's time. More specifically, if you look up the actual, what's the difference between a hamlet and a village, or a hamlet and a township, we've all heard this word Hamlet sometimes used to mean a small town, a hamlet in the hills of, upstate New York or wherever. What it originally specifically meant was a town without a church, right? That was the difference between a hamlet and a village. A village had a church and a hamlet didn't. A town so small that it didn't even have a church. Now, whether Shakespeare was intrigued and entranced by this other meaning of the prince's name, a town without a church, and that it informed his plan for and his ideas for the character to some extent, is certainly it's intriguing to think about. Hamlet's situation, we've been saying from the very beginning, is of course a religious paradox about the morality or lack thereof of revenge. Does revenge become okay even though God and Jesus say it's not, just because your father's ghost tells you to do it? The visual back and forth between, swear on the sword, turn it upside down, now it's a cross, that we had in Act 1, Scene 5. Hamlet certainly is obsessed with religion in the sense that he spends a lot of time talking about God's will and what God supposedly wants, and God versus the devil, and damnation and sin and the rules of the afterlife, and what makes you go to heaven or hell. He certainly excoriates other characters based on his opinion that they have offended God or broken God's commandments. So, most notably, he speaks quite extensively on this tip to his mother in Act 3, Scene 4. But we have observed after his last soliloquy in 4.4, the last time Hamlet talks to himself, that as much time as Hamlet quite famously spends talking to himself, or talking when he is alone, he never once prays. This is an odd omission for a guy who is apparently so religious, so concerned with God's will. He talks to himself about God, but never once talks to God. So possibly an intention on the other definition of Hamlet significant here. Anyway, enough about names. letter, indirectly and goofily, of course, sort of continuing the style in which Hamlet was speaking to Claudius the last time we saw them together in Act 4, Scene 3. High and mighty, you shall know I'm set naked on your kingdom. Tomorrow shall I beg leave to see your kingly eyes, when I shall, first asking your pardon thereunto, recount the occasion of my sudden and most strange return. Claudius recognizes the handwriting, though he can't make much of the message aside from that, knows it's actually by Hamlet. Claudius and Laertes, in short, realize that Hamlet's on his way back and begin plotting how to kill him. So lines 55 through 140. So a solid 100 lines are them very slowly coming up with this. We'll have a fencing exhibition between the two of you. You use a non-blunt sword and put poison on it. Scheme. Things to notice in this very slowly and laboriously devised scheme. Claudius gets the idea because he says at line 81, 2 months since, here was a gentleman of Normandy who was really good at fencing, really good at horseback tricks. Laertes recognizes that the guy he's talking about must be some fella named Lamord at line 92. Lamord happened to, while taking a break from doing tricks on his horse, happened to mention that Laertes is very good at fencing. A few things to notice in here. One is that the description of how good this Lamord guy is at horseback riding, which seems like a fairly long digression about nothing. I have seen myself and served against the French, and they can well on horseback, but this gallant had witchcraft in it. He grew unto his seat, and to such wondrous doing brought his horse as he had been incorpsed and demi-natured with the brave beast. Lines 83 through 88. Okay, we get it. He was very good at riding his horse, but I can't help but notice that the way Claudius describes this, to such wondrous doing brought his horse as he had been incorpsed and demi-natured with the brave beast. In other words, he rode his horse so well that it was like they were one being. Kind of echoes Gertrude's description of the drowning Ophelia at the end of the scene. Times she chanted snatches of old lauds as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. In other words, as though she were a different kind of being, a different kind of creature, one who belongs in the water. There's a sort of mermaid. She even uses the word. Her clothes spread wide and mermaid-like. For a while, they bore her up. Talking about Ophelia, and more on that speech when we get to it, as a half human, half something else, right? Half human, half animal, in this case, a mermaid, belonging in the water. Claudius is talking about Lamord with more half human, half animal imagery. It's like he was a centaur, right, as opposed to a mermaid, a masculine as opposed to a feminine mythological creature that's half human and half some animal. Now, both of these images remind us of one of the other sort of running preoccupations thematically and symbolically of the play, this idea of humans as being, not quite fitting into creation, being above the other animals but below the gods and angels, crawling between earth and heaven, as Hamlet puts it in 3.1. So I'm at a loss for ultimately what Shakespeare is pointing to here, I think, but I think we are supposed to notice that this scene begins with a traditionally masculine half human, half animal imagery and ends with symbolically feminine, half human, half animal imagery. Why? I'm going to keep working on that, but it's a thing to notice. We also notice, by the way, that this is one of the more, in terms of dating the play, not in the romantic sense, but meaning to figure out when it's taking place. This is one of the more ludicrously anachronistic exchanges. This guy Lamord, who's so good at horseback riding, is twice described as a Norman. He's first just introduced as a gentleman of Normandy, a region in France that's still called that today. But to be calling him a Norman in lines 90 and 91, as though he's, one of William the Conqueror's boys. This is appropriate to the play's ostensible setting in the 11th century. Claudius making reference to the Danegeld, Hamlet being sent to England for the remand of our neglected tribute. But let's not forget, the reason Laertes knows this guy is that he was at college in Paris, which is not an 11th century thing. It's a Renaissance thing, right? Just as Hamlet being away at college in Wittenberg, which was not even founded until 1502, is a Renaissance thing rather than a medieval thing. And even more so, going on to describe, he gave you such a masterly report for art and exercise in your defense, and for your rapier most especial. In other words, Laertes is really good at fencing, which is done with rapiers. Those very thin, swishy swords with the basket thing over the hand. Now, this does not match at all, even close, in terms of when this is supposed to be. Rapiers and fencing with them was not a thing until the 16th century. Normans, in the William the Conqueror sense, had stopped being a thing long before the 16th century. So the idea of a Norman talking about fencing with rapiers is completely bat crap in terms of when this is supposed to be. It's off by, no kidding, 500 years. A modern audience doesn't notice this. They just think of it as, well, it's the past, when people in the past fought with swords. We're not as up today on, different kinds of swords and when they were from. But it's honestly as anachronistic as if today someone made a movie about Christopher Columbus and depicted him and his crew playing video games, right? Off by 500 years. That's how much it's off by to have a Norman talking about fencing with rapiers. Now, this is not like the other anachronistic things in the play. I do not think it is a mistake on Shakespeare's part, and I don't think it's even so much about not caring. I think he is doing something weird with time. More on that in the vid for 5.1. Another weird thing, sir, this report of his, in other words, the report that Laertes is super duper good at fencing, the king says, this report of his did Hamlet so envenom with his envy that he could nothing do but wish and beg your sudden coming o'er to play with you. In other words, when Lamord was here doing tricks on his horse and talking about how good at fencing Laertes is, Hamlet was mad with jealousy and wished Laertes would come back so that Hamlet could have a fencing match with him to see who was better. Now, Claudius is trying to manipulate Laertes here, so he could be laying it on a bit thick about how jealous Hamlet supposedly was, but Hamlet does later on talk about being in continual practice at fencing, does agree to the fencing match and expect to do well in it. So we know that the idea that Hamlet considers himself a good fencer and is proud of this is not being totally made up by Claudius here. Now, we might notice this as more than a bit ironic, right? This guy who has spent most of a very long play so far being unable to stab someone, or at least unable to stab the right guy. Is apparently an expert swordsman. Just as we were surprised by the image, if his letter to Horatio in 4:6 can be trusted, surprised by the image of Hamlet, swinging on a rope onto a pirate ship with a knife in his teeth in this sea battle, as he describes doing in the letter in 4:6. This guy who has had such trouble committing a specific act of violence. Well, I think Shakespeare wants to impress upon us with this that it's not just that Hamlet is a wuss or a nerd in the modern senses of those terms, as a lot of people do think of him today. I myself have often joked that an appropriate subtitle for this play might be to borrow an old joke from The Simpsons and call it "Help, My Son is a Nerd." But more honestly, Hamlet isn't one, right? We do hear and see with our own eyes in 5.2 that the problem isn't with a lack of physical coordination or with bodily weakness. Hamlet is a very capable athlete physically, as indeed any medieval prince, certainly a medieval Viking, basically prince, would have been. People joked at the time about the casting of Mel Gibson as Hamlet back in 1990. And though I agree that his performance was not the best ever, though, better than you would imagine if you haven't seen the film, visually, he makes more sense than anyone. Right? A medieval Danish prince would have been a big, jacked, blonde guy. So the idea that Hamlet is, emo or whatever, these jokes that people make about him now, is not totally accurate. So this Hamlet is an expert fencer, Hamlet is a great athlete thing we get reminded of here, impresses upon the audience that the problem is not physical, right? The reason he's unable to stab Claudius is not just because he's gonna, trip over his own feet and drop the sword like he's Urkel or something. It's a psychological problem, not a physical one. Laertes, was your father dear to you? The king asks around line 107. Or are you like the painting of a sorrow, a face without a heart? There we get another reference for those who are keeping track to the play's ongoing difference between real life and art. Theme, a difference between real people and fictional characters, right? The painting of a sorrow would literally be, right, a face without a heart. If we're looking at a painting of someone, no matter how well done the painting is and how much emotion we think we see on the face of the figure in the painting, they are literally two-dimensional, right? They literally have no depth. It's an illusion created by a skilled painter. And of course, they don't have a heart, right? A figure in a painting has no internal organs, right? They have no inside. There is only an outside. So from the very beginning, and certainly coming out of Hamlet's mouth, from when he first enters in 1.2, with his these indeed seem for their actions that a man might play, but I have that within which passeth show speech to his mom about how everything that's on the outside is BS because it can be faked. It's what's on the inside that counts. But fictional people, whether they are characters in a play or characters in a painting, as in this line here, do not have any interiority. And I think Shakespeare knows that is what he is, more than in any single other one of his plays, messing around with and struggling with here. To what extent can I give a stage role, a fake character, interiority, or the idea that he as many have observed about Hamlet himself, that he knows more than he says, that he has subconscious motivations that even he himself is not aware of. And he is the first, really in human history, fictional character that people started psychoanalyzing in this way. And for my money, I think that the fact that there even is such a thing as psychoanalysis today, that 300 years later, Shakespeare's biggest fan, whether he knew it or not, Sigmund Freud, the idea that he even was able to come up with the concept of psychoanalyzing people is because Shakespeare invites us to do it with his characters, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, more than the others, perhaps even more than all the others put together. We then get another couple of heavy doses of irony from Claudius at around lines 119 and 127, when he is encouraging Laertes to keep his anger up and keep charging forward with the kill Hamlet, get revenge on Hamlet mission. That we should do when we would, he begins at line 118. For this would changes, and hath abatements and delays, as many as there are tongues, or hands, or accidents. And then this should is like a spendthrift's sigh that hurts by easing. Now, the audience is almost chuckling at this, because we know, and I think even he is starting to suspect, that the only reason this Claudius guy is still alive is because Hamlet did not do what he would do when he would, despite promising that in Act 1, Scene 5, promising his dad's ghost that he would sweep to his revenge as swift as meditation or the thoughts of love. And he then ended up doing, of course, the exact opposite of that. Claudius puts a name on it here. If you get the idea to do something into your head, do it immediately, because once the passion cools, you'll start making excuses about why you can't do it for this reason and can't do it yet for that reason, and you end up never doing it. Now, the fact that people are like this, Claudius criticizes the fact that people are like this, but we, the audience, know the fact that people are like this has saved his life. Laertes says at line 126 that he wants to cut his throat to the church, cut Hamlet's throat in the church. Claudius observes, no place indeed should murder sanctuarize. Revenge should have no bounds. Now here, he definitely doesn't know, but we do, that, again, he himself almost got murdered in a church back in Act 3, Scene 3, and only didn't because the guy who was right behind him, about to stab him, thought better of it based on the fact that he was praying. Hamlet, being remiss, most generous and free from all contriving, will not peruse the foils, so that with ease or with a little shuffling you may choose a sword unbaited. Claudius finally getting to his point, saying we'll have an exhibition fencing match between you and Hamlet, and Hamlet is so crazy or trusting or whatever the heck he is, he won't look carefully at the swords. We'll give you one that doesn't have the little bally, blunty thing at the end, and you can actually kill him, and it'll look like an accident. Notice that the term Claudius uses here, shuffling, is the same verb he uses about what you don't get to do in God's courtroom in the afterlife, back when he is praying in Act 3, Scene 3. In the corrupted currents of this world, offences gilded hand may shove by justice, and oft 'tis seen the wicked prize itself buys out the law, but 'tis not so above, there is no shuffling. So Shakespeare's association of this word with Claudius And I guess it's an interesting parallel to its most famous usage in the play, um, Hamlet using it to describe death itself, shuffling off this mortal coil. Laertes said, okay, great. I've got an even better idea. I'll put poison on the sword, right? I bought an unction of a mountebank, so mortal that, etc. I'll gall him slightly, it may be death. King then says, and I have an even better idea. We'll also put, as long as you've got it, some of your poison in the cups for the toast. When he calls for drink, line 159, I'll have preferred him a chalice for the nonce we're on, but sipping, if you by chance escape your venom stuck, our purpose may hold there. So there'll be poison on the swords, poison in the cups, poison everywhere. What could possibly go wrong? We'll find out in Act 5, Scene 2. But before they decide to put poison in yet a third thing, they hear a noise outside the door. The door opens, and in comes Gertrude with some shocking news, which we, of course, know is to announce the death of Ophelia. In the "there is a willow grows ascant the brook" speech. It bears mentioning that this is the longest unbroken speech by any female character in the whole play. There are, depending on what we count the player queen as, whether it's set after the Restoration or before the Restoration, whether she's played by an actual woman or a boy in drag. But the only two principal female characters in the play are Gertrude and Ophelia, occupying these very significant roles to our main character. It's Hamlet's mom and his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend or intended. The longest speech by any female character in the play is one of those women announcing the death of the other in a natural order inversion. Right, the play's overarching symbolic mother, right, Gertrude the Queen, is announcing the death of the younger, right, the wife, the daughter, the maiden question mark figure, Ophelia, right? This essentially the mother and the maiden, rather than the mother figure becoming the crone and dying first. Its nature is inverted. It is the younger woman who dies. Now, this inversion of the natural order of death, we've already discussed, would have been on Shakespeare's mind since, as many have conjectured, this play to some extent might have been part of his mourning process for his only son, Hamnet, with an N, Hamlet Shakespeare, who died in 1596 at the age of 11. Shakespeare, in this play, corrects nature, right, by having it be what is supposed to happen, the father dying and the son being left, rather than the even more tragic other way around, the child dying and the parent being left, as it happened to him. We have, with the two female characters, though Gertrude and Ophelia are not related, they are still, psychologically speaking, right, the symbolic mother and symbolic young woman of the play. So we have an inversion of the younger dying instead of the elder. And even in the speech itself, gosh, there is a lot to notice here. There with fantastic garlands did she make of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. So there's a continuing in the related, right, the offstage. Oh, and the fact that this happens offstage and is related is a nice sort of tragic parallelism to in Act 2, Scene 1. Right, in the first scene of the second act, just as this is the last scene of the second to last act, we had Ophelia burst in at the end, very upset, talking about, I just ran into Hamlet, doublet all unbraced, no hat upon his head, stockings fouled, etc., and you won't believe what happened. We have here Gertrude bursting in at the end of the scene to announce another important offstage thing, Ophelia's death. She is described as making garlands with flowers, just as she was doing in the last scene where we actually saw her, the mad scene 4.5. In particular, one type of flower, long purples that liberal shepherds give a grosser name, but our cold maids do dead men's fingers call them. The implication here being that the liberal shepherds have a dirty name for these long purple flowers. It doesn't take much imagination here. They're dead men's dicks or something to that effect, something phallic. Our cold maids, in other words, our modest virgins, euphemistically call these flowers dead men's fingers. So the implication that Ophelia is unaware of the dirty name for these flowers, is further symbolism of her innocence, the fact that she is in, the expression would be in over her head. She has been for the whole play, and even in the description of her death, of her sinking into the water, we have the world closing in above her head, and with the addition of this dead men's fingers bit that she's unaware of. That means, appropriately enough, if she sinks, the flowers are floating on top of the surface. This means that even at the very moment of Ophelia's death, there is literally a dirty joke going over her head, as there has been for so much of the play. On the pendant boughs her crowned weeds clamoring to hang, an envious sliver broke. In other words, she was going to hang the garlands she'd made of flowers on a branch. It broke. She falls into the water. Now look at the description of what actually kills her, right? It's not that she can't swim. Her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like a while they bore her up. So all the clothes she had on filled with air, and for a while they helped her stay afloat. Which time she chanted snatches of old lauds as one incapable of her own distress. She just sang tunes as she had been doing in the mad scene in 4/5, as though she didn't know she were in any danger, or like a creature native and endued unto that element. Coming back to the mythological sort of half man, half animal, or half woman in this case, half animal, mermaid idea, as though she belonged in the water. But long it could not be, till that her garments, heavy with their drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. So it's not just that Ophelia can't swim, it's her clothes. And there is a metaphor, a pretty clear metaphor in here that is so ahead of its time, so brilliant, and I think to some extent deliberate on Shakespeare's part. It's that her clothes get wet, right? Now think about female clothing from back then, all of the different layers of stuff that they used to make women wear, all of the petticoats and everything else, and those long, huge skirts, all of that stuff, if it got wet, must have weighed, 100 pounds. I mean, even a very strong athlete and an excellent swimmer would have considerable difficulty staying afloat for long if you're wearing all of that stuff and it's wet. So it is literally, a female social role, literally society's expectations of women that kill Ophelia, right? Feminine clothing, when it gets wet, is impossible to stay afloat in. Now, for a while, it helped her. Right, it had air pockets in it, and kept her afloat. But then when it got waterlogged, she sank. So some metaphor here about, women being in a or a young pretty woman being in a privileged position in society as long as she plays ball with what society expects of young pretty women, and then the second she does not, right, the all the air goes out of the clothing and they fill up with water, and she sinks. Now many people may be ready to say that I am reading a modern way of thinking about gender symbolism into Shakespeare in a way that he couldn't possibly have intended, and with any other writer from 400 years ago, I might be saying that myself. But Shakespeare's genius being immeasurable, positing a boundary to it, is something that it makes almost no sense to do. Whether he was, although yes, I suppose it is implausible that he was consciously thinking, I want a metaphor about female social roles and rewards and punishments here. Oh, I know, I'll use the clothes. That might be a bit much, but the idea that he is such a genius, that he is at all times doing such things half consciously, formulating a meaning and a way of taking a metaphor that society will only, that readers will only decode centuries later, only half consciously. That doesn't mean he isn't really doing it. Just as we would say, Jimi Hendrix was probably not consciously thinking about every single note he was hitting, right? You're a genius at that level. You are to some extent doing it without thinking. I don't think it's something that a modern reader is forcing upon this speech to see it along those symbolic lines. Now, one other note here on the whole Ophelia is pregnant theory that we discussed, or Ophelia was, I suppose, at this point, pregnant, that we discussed in 4.5. The idea that because she falls in the river when a bough breaks, the idea that this is Shakespeare referencing the folk tune Rockabye Baby, and that it should be interpreted as yet another Ophelia pregnancy clue, right? Falling when the bough breaks. Well, I've researched how old the song Rockabye Baby is for exactly this reason. And as though I was in love with that clue when I first thought I found it, I must admit that there is absolutely no indication that Rockabye Baby existed any earlier than the early 18th century at the earliest. I found one source that claims it may date to the 17th century and have originated in America based on colonists observing a way that Native Americans hung cradles from trees. But even then, Jamestown is not founded until 1607. This play is 1599 through 1601. We would honestly have to be positing a conspiracy theory about the Roanoke colony, founded in 1593, in order to defend the supposition that this speech is intentionally referencing Rockabye Baby. That's probably going a bit too far. Anywho, alas, then she is drowned. To which Laertes responds with perhaps his most moving lines: "Too much of water hast thou, poor Ophelia, and therefore I forbid my tears. But yet it is our trick. Nature her custom holds, let shame say what it will. When these are gone, the woman will be out," referring to his tears, and the woman meaning both well, having both a sexist and a tender meaning. The woman meaning the shameful feminine side of himself, right? He's crying when he should be manning up and getting revenge, saying to the king, don't worry, I'll be done acting like a woman in just a minute here. But also meaning the woman meaning his sister, when these tears I'm crying are gone, my sister will truly be gone because these tears are all I have left of her. Laertes here on stage with the highest ranking man and woman in the play on stage along with the king and queen. Maybe in this speech sort of directing some of it to the king with one meaning and some of it to the queen with another meaning. Now, a couple questions remain here. One, as many people quite defensively ask, how did she know? Right? Gertrude comes in with this long description of Ophelia's death. What was she watching? If she was watching, why didn't she help? Or does she just sort of have this knowledge psychically? And there are places, more usually in the history plays, where female characters, especially older female characters, not that Gertrude is usually staged as being that old, have knowledge, especially of other female characters, that there's no logical way they would have. Shakespeare is sometimes playing with a sort of women are psychic implication, or whether she just got the news secondhand from shepherds. Perhaps she saw it from a high window in the castle and was too far away to help, and by the time she ordered attendants to run and help her, it was too late. Of course, if she was that far away, how she knew that she was singing, or is able to name all the flowers in the garlands, or is able to describe exactly what the clothes were doing from moment to moment, seems a bit much. So yes, there is some, we need to kind of, I think, flex our suspension of disbelief here. I don't know that there is any kind of elaborate theory to be built about the fact that Gertrude knows all of this. Some people connect the "how does Gertrude know" question with the Ophelia is pregnant theory, and say that Gertrude knew Ophelia was planning to commit suicide, possibly even helped her escape the castle. And then this is because she knew she was pregnant and decided that suicide was the only acceptable option for a woman in her condition. Okay, as with all of the Ophelia is pregnant stuff, if I want people to admit that they can't disprove the aspects of that theory that I like, I must admit that I can't disprove that reading of Gertrude's role in it either. But an even more interesting question for me, rather than how does Gertrude know about every single type of flower Ophelia was picking, is, are we supposed to believe that she overheard any of that stuff that Claudius and Laertes were talking about right before she came in? I mean, but stay what noise at line 162, right? They hear her starting to open up the door or whatever. Now, before someone opens a door and comes into a room, where were they right before they did that? Well, they were on the other side of the door. They were talking very clearly about killing Hamlet and putting poison on everything right before she came in. Are we to assume that Gertrude overheard any of that? If so, then it makes her actions in Act 5, Scene 2 very different. So just as we're wondering, that letter, this to the queen, the messenger that the messenger had for her at the beginning of the scene, What did it say? And has she already read that letter when she enters? So what did the letter say? Did she overhear them? What's going on in Gertrude's mind from here to the end of the play? Fascinating. And one of my favorite moments, a great bit of nonverbal acting from Gertrude, or from Julie Christie, the actress who's playing Gertrude in the 1996 film, when Claudius extends his hand to her at the end of the scene with his, therefore let's follow, as though she's just going to automatically take his hand and go with him, as we've seen her do any number of times throughout the play so far. She doesn't take his hand and gives him this look, this withering look, implying that maybe either because of the letter or because she overheard outside the door, she knows what he's up to, and he gives her this very guilty look back, as though he knows that she knows. It can, of course, as with anything involving an expression on someone's face, be staged differently, but that is one way of doing it. So when Act 4, the messiest act in the play, 7 scenes, 5 of them quite brief. As Act 4 ends, it is the two women of the play, I think, who are uppermost in our mind. Gertrude and what she does or doesn't know, and what she is going to do about what she does or doesn't know from here on out. And of course, Ophelia, whose death we've just heard about. Now, a note on Ophelia herself. We've remarked already on her kind of outsized reputation among Shakespeare's heroines, and how this is, at odds with how small her role actually is in terms of how many lines she has, less than 200, how many scenes she appears in, only 5 out of the play's 20 scenes. Now, of course, she has maybe the best, the juiciest thing to do for an actress in all of Shakespeare, the mad scene in Act 4, Scene 5, but also the description of her death. She is significantly the only character in all of Shakespeare who dies by drowning, unless we count Clarence being drowned in the butt of Momsey wine in Richard III. So she's the only character who drowns in water anyway. And the association of water, of running water, with a sort of traditional, spiritus mundi sort of idea of femininity. She dies surrounded by flowers, in water, with her clothes spreading. Certainly, this description of her death has been a popular subject for painters, over the years. More so than any tableau achieved by, say, Rosalind of As You Like It, who certainly is a better role model in modern feminist terms. Smarter, more resourceful, much higher self-esteem than Ophelia is. But the idea that it is Ophelia, rather than one of Shakespeare's, in today's terms, strong female characters like Rosalind or Cleopatra, or even Juliet, who's much smarter than Romeo. That it's Ophelia who has taken a central place in terms of being referenced in song, in painting, in psychoanalytic books about young women and feminism and problems that are specific to women. Her status as, on one hand, the ultimate if we're going to use the word victim, the ultimate victim, certainly of this play, the one indisputably innocent character who knew nothing about any ghost or any murder or any affair or any feigned madness or any of it. Just, had a boyfriend, and the next thing she knows, he's nuts, and then her father's dead, and then for whatever reason, she herself has gone mad, and then she's dead. The fact that everything ends up kind of dumped on her, and that she is, well, the certainly the blackest mark in Hamlet's permanent record, more so even, I think, than the stabbing of Polonius. The fact that she is, that it's our sympathy for and our sort of fascination with her that keeps us from being able to ever completely embrace Hamlet as this sort of great guy that everyone should be like, as much as certain stagings might encourage us to do. Right? It is Ophelia that is the problem that Hamlet fans, meaning fans of the prince, not the play, can't solve. Perhaps most of all, in the next scene when he curiously decides to heckle her funeral. So more on that in Act 5, Scene 1. See you then.